Here we are for another round of the 70s versus the 90s, and it's a pair of brooding gangster films when I put Peter Yates's The Friends of Eddie Coyle against Phil Joanou's State of Grace. And this one was a real interesting one to get through because both of these movies kind of have their own style and flair to them, but one of them definitely lacks punch, So let's just dive right on in to the nitty and the picky. First up, we have Peter Yates's The Friends of Eddie Coyle, starring Robert Mitchum as the titular character Eddie Coyle. And of course, Robert Mitchum was one of the biggest like screen badasses of all time, especially in the late 40s and all through the 50s and even well into the 60s, man. He would kick ass in like gangster films, westerns, any type of thing. Here in 1973, of course, he's gotten a little older, and of course, he can't really be playing those action roles like he used to. But now it's a role that he basically aged gracefully into, and almost an Academy Award worthy performance, and he's in a bit of a pickle, because he's a gun runner essentially. He purchases guns for anybody trying to do criminal activities and shit, and he got caught, and he's facing a fucking prison stint, and he's trying his best to get out of it. He's still doing his thing. He's trying to make sure his family's set up, because he's got a wife and kids, but he's also on the fence about, being a fink. And the thing about it is, he had the choice to rat on his friends, but he didn't, because he was a real ass dude. But now he's at a situation where, I may rat on other motherfuckers. There's also the young dude that he's buying guns from and shit. He ends up ratting on him. And of course, Richard Jordan, who's absolutely brilliant as a treasury agent in the film, turns out too that Peter Boyle, who's a bartender who also dabbles in some illegal activity, he's actually a fink for Richard Jordan's character. We see him all through the film, basically ratting on everybody and all this shit, but nobody knows it. It's pretty slick. He thinks he's on the up and up. So much so that as in through the film, people just assume Eddie Coyle's the one that's finking on everybody because he's about to be sent up and shit. That when stuff goes awry, like Alex Rocco, who's leading a group that's been hitting a lot of banks in the film, and they just assume that Eddie Coyle's the one that sold him out when he was about to. There's a lot of like brilliant irony in this film. It does move at a slow pace, but the thing about it is Peter Yates packs enough punch in this film. This is honestly one of his best movies in regards to, like, some of the stuff that Peter Yates did was like wildly mid, but this one is a real gem of a fucking film, especially the cast. I mean, like I said, Robert Mitchum, Peter Boyle, Richard Jordan, and they're all phenomenal. Even Alex Rocco in the film is exceptional, and even like the other side character, like there's nobody in this film that's not good. Everybody kind of does their own thing, and but the ending is what it is just so fucking tragic because they put a hit out on Eddie Coyle and they get Peter Boyle's character to do the hit, take him to a fucking hockey game and then fucking just kill him and leave him hanging. And it's crazy because Peter Boyle is a bigger rat than Eddie Coyle, and he's the one that sold all these motherfuckers out, save for the fucking kid with the fucking badass fucking Dodge Charger. That shit was pretty fucked up. But and the thing about it is, like, for a movie that is mostly talking, I mean, there's not a lot of action in this film. There's a lot of like brooding debate and stuff. It's actually very interesting because the dialogue in this film is crisp as shit, man. Like the writer of this fucking film, let's see what his name was because it very implicitly states it. Paul Monash. This is based off a novel. Paul Monash's script is absolutely fucking phenomenal, and it's very well shot. The music in it's really fucking good. It just has this. The 70s crime films were just so fucking good. They were gritty, they were raw, and they featured like some of the best performances of that decade. It was like really that might have been the best genre other than horror. Like crime and horror films were like the best shit that they made in the 70s, especially 1973 for some reason was an exceptional year for crime films, because we also got shit like Charlie Varick and Mean Streets, just to name a few. You know, I'm just off the top of my head, those are the ones I can think of, and I guarantee you there's at least 10 others that were phenomenal that year. But you know, the whole movie, you know, filled with irony and brilliant acting and a lot of like, you know, a few comedic moments too. You know, it's just a real ass movie. It's a very enjoyable treat to see. And then we move forward to Phil Joanou's State of Grace, which has a phenomenal cast. And I mean, it's got Sean Penn, brilliant Gary Oldman. Gary Oldman is just fucking chewing every bit of scenery that he can get his hands on in this film. And Ed Harris. And here we have the Irish mob in New York, or the Friends of Eddie Coyle. If I didn't mention it, it took place in Boston. And now we're in New York with State of Grace. And that particular film is like, this one's kind of an even slower burn than the Friends of Eddie Coyle. Friends of Eddie Coyle runs about an hour and 42 minutes, whereas like State of Grace runs for 2 hours and 14 minutes, which in my opinion feels a bit too long, you know. And also, speaking of the cast, there's a few other like great actors in it, like Robin Wright, John C. Reilly, John Turturro, and among many others. But the film itself features Sean Penn, he, you know, as an undercover cop, and he's trying to infiltrate the Irish mob in there, which is led by Ed Harris in the film. You know, he's a good friend, played by Gary Oldman, and you know, they end up getting. It's got a great opening. Like, it opens like a fucking bullet, and then it just kind of tapers off. You know, of course, there's always a fucking romance in the film because, of course, Sean Penn gets smitten with Robin Wright, and then like they turns out she's, you know, the sister of the dudes that are running the fucking mob and shit, and you know, and then there's conflict there because then of course he tells her he's a cop and all this shit just to prove to her that he's different and all this shit, and it's like such an unnecessary thing to do. You know, I'm not one to down romance, but it just feels like some of this shit just always feels forced in these movies. You know, it's like have it a little more organic. You know, because oh, let's just add another layer of conflict. You know, because if you were truly professional, like if you were like me, an undercover cop, and truly professional, you wouldn't be trying to like, you know, get involved with motherfuckers that you're trying to take down. That's just a fucking recipe for disaster. And then he, you know, gets to kill his own friend, and then at that end, that shootout is kind of fucking lame, because like the thing about it is using slow motion is a fucking thing that you really got to be careful with, because like it can look shitty really fast. You got to be very stylized. Like Sam Peckinpah and John Woo, they understand how to use slow motion, but most directors just kind of feels like, well, maybe we would put you in and you're gonna really feel every bit of violence, you know, and stuff. And like, it's got great moments though. Anytime Gary Oldman's on the screen, it's fucking phenomenal. But then, you know, he like gets done in about halfway through the fucking movies, and then we just get Sean Penn's brooding ass, and then like Ed Harris is brilliant in the film too. But I feel like I said, I feel like the film runs a bit too long. It's not sure exactly what it wants to be. I get tired of the sensitive gangster movies. Like Friends of Eddie Coyle understood that fine line of being tough and sensitive at the same time, because you got a guy in a shitty situation and he's having to make a really hard choice. Sean Penn's character in State of Grace, he puts himself in this position and he continually fucks it up at every chance that he gets. And he comes out on top. You know, everything seemingly works out for him and shit, but like I said, this movie, for the extraordinary cast that it has, I feel like they deserved a better script and a better director. So that's one reason that I got to give it to the Friends of Eddie Coyle, because one, it's just a better movie. Like, I'm sitting there watching the Friends of Eddie Coyle, and it's keeping me entertained all the way through. Like, even though I've seen it many times, you still get surprised by how it comes out, as opposed to like State of Grace. I'm just waiting for whenever the fuck this movie is over, or whenever Gary Oldman comes on the screen, and once he gets killed, there's really no point in watching this movie anymore, because this is going to be the same basic fucking bullshit that you see all the damn time in these little sensitive gangster movies, especially the ones that they made in the 90s. Like, gangster films in the 90s could be badass, but this was before Tarantino comes on the scene. So it was like Tarantino kind of injected some fucking balls back into the fucking gangster picture. Whereas like it was that whole like all through the '80s, you know, you would get these like fucking sensitive gangster movies, mostly done by like indie filmmakers that, you know, wanted to be badass but didn't want to like fall into the tropes that make fucking gangster films great. And second of all, I, you know, for the acting, I would probably say the acting's about the same, you know, because like you know, because Sean Penn is one of the greatest actors of all time, as well as like of course Gary Oldman is the greatest actor of his generation, and Ed Harris is no slouch either. But I just feel like they needed better material and a better director. Whereas like Peter Yates may not be the best director going, but like he made some pretty damn good films, and I believe right now in this little fucking long self indulgent journey, he's sitting at 3-0 with his shit because like, and plus Robert Mitchum's performance is so much better than anybody else's shit. Like that's a true director that knows how to direct somebody like Robert Mitchum, and all other side characters and stuff is just fucking brilliant. Because also when there's action in the Friends of Eddie Coyle, it's fucking like it's realistic, you know, and it's very like intense and in your face. There's some things in State of Grace where it's like, all right, come on now, you know, not as like hyper real, surrealistic shit as like Romeo is Bleeding, but it's still like is a little like, all right, this is like motherfuckers playing in a sandbox where it's like Friends of Eddie Coyle, like most of the films in the 70s were like real adult films, you know, that dealt with adult shit and didn't play around with stuff in a way that made you like, you know, just want to like enjoy it. You know, you really had to feel that shit. So for anybody keeping score, that is 86 to 67. 70s are up by 19 now. Man, they are just continually kicking ass. The 90s will come back with those 1-2 punches, but the 70s, you know, put them back down on the ropes because in my opinion, the greatest decade for cinema. And you know, right now it's looking like I'm right. That lead continues to grow. You know, it'll shrink a little bit, but then it'll expand some more. So who knows? This shit is one long self-indulgent journey from an asshole's opinion to see which decade is better. You know, so if I've said anything wrong, anything you disagree with, feel free to eviscerate me in the comments because, like I said, this is one asshole's opinion, and I'm just trying to find for myself which decade was better. It's looking like the 70s, but we still got a long way to go before I can definitely say that. So just know there's always somebody lurking behind the corner. So you better watch your ass.